Welcome everyone, Blizzcon is right around the corner, so I'm going to tell you why I believe Augmentation Priest will be announced as a new priest specialization. I'll talk about what that spec might look like and why I believe there's already justification in the game supporting this idea. Just to be clear, I have no insider information, none of this is confirmed or even speculated. This video is more about having some fun thinking about how cool the spec could be. First, what do I mean by an augmentation spec? In patch 10.15, Evokers got a new DPS spec called Augmentation. This spec is completely original and I believe is a test for a completely new role getting added to the game. Since its inception, WoW has had 3 specs: Tank, Healer, and DPS. But although Augmentation Evoker is classified right now as a DPS spec, it is a completely new way to play the game. If you haven't had a chance to learn what Augmentation Evoker is all about, it does the overwhelming majority of its damage by buffing its teammates and does very little damage by itself, yet still fills the DPS role. Having such a unique spec act as an entirely new role gives it a monopoly on that support role position. Imagine if the game only had one class that could heal. It's basically like that right now with Evoker. I believe that Augmentation Evoker was a test to see how well it worked in the game. It's very strange to add a completely new spec to the game in a 0.5 patch, unless they intentionally did it to collect some performance data to make sure their rollout of this brand new support role went smoothly next expansion. If they introduce a brand new support role in the next expansion, I think they would have at least 4 classes able to play this role, and I think Priest is at the top of this list. So why am I so convinced Priests are at the top of this list? First of all, Season 4 Shadowlands Holy Priest was probably the closest thing to a support role this game has ever seen prior to the introduction of the Augmentation Evoker. Not only did you have Power Infusion buffing your top DPS player, your Night Fae Covenant ability, Fae Guardians, could be used to reduce the cooldown of one of your DPS player's major DPS cooldowns by up to 40 seconds. Alternatively, you can move your cooldown reduction fairy back and forth between 2 DPS players to reduce both of their cooldowns. These 2 support abilities could very easily be part of an Augmentation Priest support spec. Second, I think it's possible that Holy and Discipline get combined into one spec to maintain the 3 spec lineup. For the last several expansions, Discipline has been getting Holy spells added, and Holy has been getting Discipline spells added. With the new Dragonflight talent system, I can see a world where the new combined healing talent tree has one side with Atonement and other disc spells, and the other side of the tree has your Holy Words and Echo of Light talents. While possible, I think this combination is a little less likely than just giving Priest a 4th spec, since it might add too much confusion for players and make the talent tree a bit cluttered, but it's a real possibility and they have taken steps in this direction. So what might an Augmentation Priest look like? To understand this requires a little more information on how Augmentation Evoker is played. While there is a lot of nuance and complexity to playing an Augmentation Evoker at a high level, it basically boils down to doing 2 things. First, maintain the highest uptime possible on the Ebon Might buff, which gives 5 players a massive amount of primary stats. This buff dramatically boosts DPS numbers as well as healing and tank survivability. The buff itself has a base cooldown of 30 seconds and a base buff duration of 10 seconds. Various talents, stats, and spells reduce the 30-second cooldown and extend the 10-second buff duration with the goal of getting close to 100% uptime on the buff. The second active DPS boost is an ability called Prescience, which can be reasonably kept on 2 players. It gives them 3% crit and a 15% chance for any damage or healing they do to be duplicated. So how would this transfer over to a priest? First of all, Power Infusion would clearly slot into one of these 2 ability roles. I think it's more likely that a version of Power Infusion would fill the Prescience role, since Power Infusion buffs haste and Prescience buffs crit. Power Infusion would most likely pick up a second charge, go down to a 10-second cooldown, and have its numbers tweaked slightly to provide a similar DPS gain to Prescience. So what would be the Priest equivalent to Ebon Might, Evoker's primary stat buff? I've put a lot of thought into this one, and I think an Augmentation Priest would most likely be more of a Shadow Priest than a Holy or Disc Priest, primarily because of the builder-spender model that Augmentation Evoker currently uses. The ability that extends Ebon Might uptime costs Essence, and your ability to keep extending Ebon Might relies on your Essence generation and Essence Burst procs. I think Insanity or even the old school Shadow Orbs would make a lot of sense as a resource to either extend the duration or reduce the cooldown of the Priest's 5-person primary stat buff ability. I think all 4 of the support specs would buff primary stat and be mutually exclusive with one another. I don't think they would make Power Infusion a big haste buff for 5 people. This would lead to too much of a multiplicative effect by stacking all the different augmentation support classes. I think the potential new Priest ability that buffs 5 players' primary stat would likely have some sort of old god theme to it. We'll call it Nazoth's Anger. Consuming Insanity or some sort of proc would extend the buff duration or reduce the buff's cooldown so you could maintain close to 100% uptime. There are so many other cool directions they could take this spec that are simply too wild for me to list here. For the sake of completion, I think the other two augmentation support classes would be Shaman and Demon Hunter. Shaman would just be too easy with all of its totems. Wind Fury is already a big party buff, and there's a lot of room to improve on that. I don't really think Demon Hunter makes the most sense from an RP perspective, but with only 2 specs, I think it's more likely they give it a 3rd spec than give another class a 4th spec. I also think Blizzard would make at least one of these 4 specs a melee spec. Adding this new support role to the game would also lay the foundation for a Bard class 2 expansions from now, but let's limit this video to only so much crazy. Let me know your wild ideas for what you think a support priest or any other support class might look like. As always, good luck and thanks for watching.